And Frederick.
With Thomas.
And Frederick.
Hello, stranger. Welcome to State of the Franchise, or as we are calling it this month, Scream of the Franken-chise. I am one of your ghosts, Tom Stadler, here with my fellow co-ghost.
Oh, I like that. That was good. Co-ghost, I'm Fred.
Fred Dakin. I'm like, should we have like spooky names too? Should I be like Tom Stabler or something? Or
Yeah, I like Stabler. I feel like we've had this conversation because yours is so good than mine. Like, my name kind of sounds like I'm a Victorian ghost already, like Frederick James Dakin III.
Or you could be like Dead Dakin.
Yeah, Dead Dakin.
Very exciting topic this week to kick off our very horror / spooky themed month. We're obviously talking about a video game franchise that has been around for now almost 30 years.
Feels like my whole life.
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, and it does have kind of like some of those urban legend stuff around it a little bit.
Yes, I definitely digested early Resident Evil through other people, like on the playground, you know? I was never allowed near these games.
Yeah, it was definitely like a word of mouth type movie of like, oh, have you guys heard about this game? They have this happen in it. And like, there's like dogs that jump through windows and scare the shit out of you. Yeah, of course, we're talking about the Resident Evil franchise, a series of video games first and foremost, but also some maybe hot and cold critically received movies and other adaptations and like TV and otherwise.
Yeah, some of those just didn't take, you know?
Yeah, they were kind of dead on arrival.
Yeah. This is good stuff. I
know.
like it.
I like it too. Well, we want to introduce our guest this week, though. Returning to the podcast is our Resident Evil, our resident Resident Evil connoisseur, Mr. Joe Francisco.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Welcome back. We made a special thing. You know, we were really just going to have you on for Batman movies, but you were like, I really want to do this video game. I'm going to use my one veto just to do one thing I want to talk about, and you decided to choose the Capcom game, Resident Evil.
That's right. Classic Capcom franchise.
Yeah.
Resident Evil.
Yeah, I don't think there was any other Capcom game series that we were talking about.
Yeah, Capcom. We can't even say it straight, but we love the games.
Capcom.
We have the games.
We love Capcom. It just sounds very like Canadian. Like, oh yeah, y'all like the Capcom there, huh?
You've been playing the Capcom
Oh
games?
yeah. Play it on the board. Take it on.
Yeah, you've been playing that Resident Evil?
Oh yeah, on the Switch there.
north?
Yeah.
That's like when your like grandparents just call it all Nintendo. You know,
yeah.
put down the Capcom.
Quit playing your Capcom.
I mean,
you gotta do your homework.
It is funny you say that though too, because I feel like the older generation did try to make like Nintendo with like the generic brand name thing of like, oh, it's like Kleenex, right, or Band-Aid. Like it's all stuff that's like, oh sure, this is the generic thing. It's like, no man, it's its own thing.
No,
Nintendo.
it's Resident Evil. It's not Capcom.
Yeah. So Resident Evil, for those who are not familiar with it, is a horror game franchise created by Capcom.
Capcom.
It really consists of survival horror scenarios, though, often in third-person shooter games, but recently have been exploring more first-person shooter games with players who are just trying to survive environments that are filled with zombies that are affected by the T virus and other variations of that virus that I'm excited to get into as we talk a little bit about that. But in Japan and Southeast Asia, this series is known as Biohazard.
Ooh.
Yeah.
And we'll get into a little bit of that during the development in our history and talk about why that name change occurred. But I guess my first question for you guys, maybe start with you, Joe, is where was your first exposure to Resident Evil?
So I was always a huge Capcom fan. You know, I liked Street Fighter, little series you guys might have heard of.
Never heard of it.
Mega Man.
Yeah.
You ever heard of that? Ghosts and
great
Goblins. Final Fight. You know, they just made a ton of games that I really enjoyed.
Right.
And I know, Fred, you're into all the spooky shit.
I am.
But I very much am usually not into the spooky shit, which is kind of interesting how much I love this franchise because back, I think, 96 was when Resident Evil 1 came out. And I have older brothers who are also huge gamers. So, like, growing up, we were playing everything, all the Capcom and all that. Capcom. And I actually watched them play, like, the first few OGs just because, like, I would, like, be, like, hiding under a blanket on the bed watching them play. I'd be like, ah, shit. Like, oh, man, like, dogs jumping through the windows, you know, hunters, like, crazy shit happening. So I did try and play them. Like, I was always fascinated that, like, the first couple you could choose your own character and they kind of had different routes.
Yeah.
And Resident Evil 1, I always remember, like, I have to go with Jill because she starts with the handgun. Like, when you're Chris, you only got a little knife. And I'm like, what am I going to do with a little knife against all these zombies?
Exactly.
And then just, like, the opening FMV intro to Resident Evil 1, I just was like, oh, shit, like, it looks so spooky because... You know, back then, early 3D games, like, they couldn't render them in as high a fidelity. So it's like the FMV, I think, really popped.
Yeah, for sure.
Even, like, to this day, I feel like the FMV versions of the characters are kind of what I have in my head of, like, oh, man, they should, like, Wesker, like, the actor they have to play Wesker looks just like how I think Wesker should always look.
Yeah, right.
And, like, same thing for all the characters, you know, Jill, Rebecca, Chris. And then, yeah, like, ever since then, I've kind of always played them. 4, obviously, love 4. 4 was just, like, was huge. I think one of the best games of all time. You can't really argue that. And then recently the remakes, like, they've been really kicking ass with the remakes and definitely been playing through all of those as they come out.
Yeah, and the remakes have been huge. We'll definitely be touching on those a little bit, which it's so interesting that we're living in an era of a lot of remakes right now, and it feels like everybody's kind of doing it in a little bit of a different way, but I feel like Capcom might be doing it the best based on what people are really looking for out of a remake. And it's funny, too, you brought up the whole thing about your brother... or your brothers playing the games, because I feel like it's almost a rite of passage for people of our generation, or just is to see a older sibling or a friend's older sibling playing it first and being like, oh yeah, that's how I first really came across it. I don't know. Did you have a similar experience, Fred?
Not with these games. I do remember trying to play like Resident Evil 2. Did it ever come on like N64? Didn't they like try to do that?
I think there was a port at some point of Resident Evil 2 on N64.
I remember playing that, and I just could not wrap my head around the movement of the character, which is something I still struggle with. I actually just downloaded the director's cut of 1, and I'm definitely doing a lot better today than I did back then, but the movement was very jarring on how you control the person within these environments with the stationary cameras. But I'd say my biggest introduction to actually playing it was when the 5th one came out. They put a demo on the Xbox 360, I believe, where it was like the first level. And I just remember playing that a bunch and eventually getting the 5th one. And that one, because it had a heavy co-op thing going, and I was like 19 at the time, like it was like the time to be playing a game like that with someone else. And
right.
I remember like just the intensity of having to stand still while shooting, because that was like the last game where that was still like a factor. But very recently, I'd say like when Village came out, I saw some gameplay of it, and I was like, this is like a Freddy game, because it's funny enough, I played more The Evil Within, which is actually made by someone I think who worked on Resident Evil, right?
So Shinji Mikami, who is the director of Resident Evil 1, was also the director of 4, and I think he's produced like 2 and 3, and he's like, in my opinion, he's like on like the Mount Rushmore of game developers, because he's just like, he's made so many hits.
Yeah.
And he's known for like the survival horror genre. But yeah, he then left Capcom, founded, I can't remember the name of his studio, I think Grasshopper, but they made the Evil Within games and the sequel to that.
Definitely, which I recommend. Evil Within is kind of like a smaller, like not a lot of people have played that, but I really recommend it. It's kind of like Last of Us meets Resident Evil. But I would say so. Once I played the Village, I went back and played Biohazard, which I just loved. And then when I say Biohazard, the 7th one, I should say.
Yeah.
And then the remakes came out, and I played 2 and 3 back to back because when I eventually played them, they were both out, and I just loved it as one experience. And now that 4 has come out, and I've played this. I just finished it today, and I'm all in on Resident Evil games. In fact, I was like streaming some of the old games just to get a little flavor of them, even a little Code Veronica today.
Ooh.
But that was me. What about you, Tom?
Yeah, I had a very similar experience, and I did confirm Resident Evil 2 did get released on N64 as well. But I definitely, similar experience to Joe, I should say, in that I had a friend whose older brother would constantly play these games, and we would be over there watching him play it on PlayStation. So I watched him play 1 and 2 and 3, and I dabbled a little bit with playing 2 and 3 at that time, just because we were like, okay, you switch off every time somebody dies, right? But outside of that, I didn't dive into this series really myself because, I was a little bit of a scaredy cat when I was younger. And I'm like, and I didn't think I was going to sell my mom on buying me any of those games. But finally, when I got to college, we had, GameCube was like a staple when I was in college. And finally, I remember somebody like left a copy of Resident Evil 4 just lying around. I'm like, all right, I'll play this game. And I mean, I loved it. And obviously, it was like, the Game of the Year edition had like all the content included. And it was just awesome. And I was like, wow, I slept on this. Because I think it kind of reminds me of like some of the things that people feel about Metal Gear Solid. And that when you look at Metal Gear Solid as like somebody who's never played it or experienced it, you see a series that looks like it's just sort of like almost Call of Duty-ish in a way. And you're like, oh, is this going to be for me? It's just spy craft or whatever. But it's really like, it's an action game. It's fun. It's like kind of got like anime inspiration. It's very big and boisterous and kind of ridiculous, like, And so I think that after I played that, I had always intended to keep going back to Resident Evil games, but just never really got into a whole lot more of them. I did play the first remake that released in 2002. Years later, I played this, I should say. And I really liked that game, but ran into the whole situation running out of ammo, and I'm like, I don't know where to go now. And I kind of fell off of it, but I've been meaning to revisit it. And I just think it's always something that's it's intrigued me. I've always like read a lot about the games and everything, but I mean, it's just a series that I think kind of pierces through the zeitgeist a little bit whenever a new one comes out, like the remakes or like Village or Biohazard. You can't help but like look into it and be like, ooh, what's new and different about this one? And I think that's one of the things that makes this series so lasting, is that the previous games are rarely ever like the ones that came before it, or the ones that come after it, outside of maybe like Biohazard and Village and maybe like 2 and 3. I don't know, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong on those.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to like the lore that they build, but they don't always really tell the story sequentially per se. Like Resident Evil 3 is like before 2 and after 3. So it's kind of like they keep switching the story up, but it's all interconnected, which the lore is kind of ridiculous, but I do enjoy it. But they kind of keep adding new concepts to it. Obviously with 4, like that was huge, going to like the over the shoulder perspective, and then Biohazard and Village going to first person. Like I feel like they've always been able to modernize the series to like what current gamers' tastes are, and just kind of has a lot of staying power, and that's why it's been around for so long.
I do like what you brought up about 4 though too, because I felt like previous to that, like I had never been a big first person shooter fan. I'm still not. But when I saw like the over the shoulder, I'm like, oh, I like the way that this plays. Like, it just feels a little more natural. Like you're playing something that you still kind of experience everything firsthand, but you can see that there's like an avatar in front of you, and it just feels different.
I always thought, like, I think Fred, you mentioned frustrations with the tank controls, and it's kind of like they always do a great job at kind of keeping the tension high in the gameplay, because like you're like, oh shit, I need more handgun ammo, or I need more green herbs, and I think some of the choices they make in not making it the most modern or easy controls is kind of meant it's like it's a conscious design choice for them to kind of like keep you on your toes for
Yeah.
like things aren't necessarily supposed to be easy.
Right.
But they do like such a good job at pacing it, and like the horror and action elements, I think just have universal appeal to everybody.
Yeah. They're not so scary that I feel like they're unpenetrable by people who would normally not be horror fans. But obviously you have people like Fred who it's like loves horror stuff, anything you can get your hands on. You're talking about The Evil Within, like it's a natural segue to go like, well, what's this all about? And
Right.
you almost realize it's not purely horror. Like there's a zombie element, but there's a whole other thing going on here with the action.
Definitely. And I was feeling it when I went back and played one recently, which it's funny, they don't have, you can buy the remake for like $20 right now on the PlayStation Store, but they have the director's cut of the first one, which is like not the updated graphics. I think it's just like more story.
Yeah.
And I was playing it, and it's really tough to move your person around. But I will say the dread factor is much higher in 1 and 2 than 4. There's an adrenaline fear that you're feeling in 4, and then I feel 6 and 7 have kind of weaponized everything and kind of use it. But I really think those first 2 games feel like real horror. But it's also, they've done a lot of action, and like you mentioned, there's definitely an anime feel to these. So I think because there's a Resident Evil for every gamer, I think that gives it staying power. Because I was watching like the Raccoon City Stories game is like, looks like a Gears of War or Call of Duty game, which, if that's your thing, there you go. Or like I said, the old ones have that old school dread. I think 4 is a good combination also of all of it as well. But I think that's the staying power is mixing up, but also just horror sells. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like a series you can kind of drop in
Definitely.
on any numbered entry you want. Like, oh, like the 4 remake just came out, like I'll just pick that up and start playing it. Whereas like it'll still be a great experience. Like you don't know all of like the connections, but you're like, oh shit, Leon's cool. Like I'll go play the RE2 remake now because
Yeah.
Leon's the main character in that. And I think it's just like you can just drop in wherever you want, which I think makes it very like more appealing to everybody.
Yeah. No, and it does have a good cast of characters. I think you were talking about seeing Wesker in the opening thing, and he's a very interesting villain for the early entries. And then you do have some protagonists that have a little bit of personality, and I think Leon obviously has been featured in a lot because he became so popular after 4. But, then you have a lot of these side characters, like you have Ada Wong, who's also part of Resident Evil 4, like her own chapter in that, and it's like, oh, so now you get these people who are kind of popular because they're always like helping out the main character or whatever.
Yeah, it is cool too because like you'll have a beloved character just like not be in an entry for like 2-3 games at a time, and then they pop back up, and you're like, oh shit, there's Chris, or like there's Claire, like this is awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting too how much the story does disconnect as the series goes on. It's less about the Umbrella Corporation, just sort of about the weird things that are in the world create like these parasites or whatever. But I think maybe that gets us a good opportunity here to really jump into the history and the development of the first game, because the first one, which we talked about, was called Biohazard. Began in 1993. The development did with Tokuro Fujiwara. And he told Shinji Mikami, who you talked about before, and some of the other coworkers to create a game using elements from Fujiwara's own game called Sweet Home on Super Nintendo. And reading this article is the first time I even heard of that. But it sounds like it was the first game that really started to play with survival horror as like a theme.
It's
Yeah.
based off of a movie.
Was that right?
Yeah, and it's like I remember I saw some clips of it. It's very, very intense and cool looking.
Yeah. What movies is it close to?
It's literally like a Japanese
Yeah.
movie called Sweet Home. I
Oh, is that
believe.
right?
Yeah, but I don't think the movie was really like popular at all.
No.
But it did serve as like the source material for the
Okay.
game.
It's not based on the movie House, is it?
No, but it's very similar vibes.
Is it?
Yeah.
You've seen House?
I've seen clips of both. House is in HBO Max and is on my queue, and I've been circling it for a while.
I'm going to just say this to you going into it. Whatever you think House is going to be, it's not. it's not. You're not gonna get like.
Yeah, when he comes up with those medical diagnosis, you're like, oh shit! Like, damn, I didn't see emphysema coming.
Now, where did I leave my painkillers? So, in late 1994, when marketing executives were setting up the release of Biohazard in the U.S., it was pointed out that securing rights to the name would be difficult because there was a Microsoft DOS game already out that had been registered under that name. Which, if you even remember whatever game Biohazard was,
I don't know.
I think I have a memory of there being a game like that, but obviously it doesn't have the staying power of Resident Evil. So they had decided to have a contest that was held among the company personnel to choose the new name, and the competition turned up the name Resident Evil, which is how it has been released and proceedingly named in the West from there on forward.
I gotta say, better title.
Resident Evil better than Biohazard?
I think so.
I just love it when like the creepy dude says it when you load the game. You're like, Resident Evil. I'm like, oh shit.
That's how you know it's real.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely more fitting with the first game, too, especially the fact that it's like in a creepy mansion, right? So it's like, yes, the Resident Evil is evil. But it feels like the rest of the series, Biohazard, does kind of feel thematically more on point, but it still works. It's a good title. And yeah, you are just kind of like intrigued by it when you hear it. So Resident Evil made its debut on PlayStation in 1996, later ported to the Sega Saturn, RIP.
Rip.
Yeah. So first entry in the series was one of the first games to be dubbed as a survival horror, which kind of coined that whole new genre after that. And I mean, certainly it inspired several different games. I think you can point to a lot of different ones, including Silent Hill and, a bunch of other.
Fatal Frame.
Yeah, I mean, you name it, right? Even though those games were a little different, but still the idea persevered. And, so Resident Evil gives players the choice between two characters that we already talked about from what is called like this strike team called Stars. And the members Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine are the first two protagonists. And they are charged with navigating a mysterious mansion where the other half of their team has gone missing. And shenanigans ensue from there when they find that there are zombies there.
Oh no!
Joe mentioned that opening video for the first game.
Yeah.
And when I loaded that up the other day, I was like, man, this is spooky. That video is cool. It's like a Rob Zombie music video or something.
I feel like whoever directed that, like, they just need to make a movie out of it.
Yes.
Like, cast the same people, let's do it. Like, that shit slapped.
We'll get to the movies later, guys, how they did with that. But I mean, it did. It really had such creepy themes, even for what the game was at the time, being like, under 10 years old. You're like shaking in your boots a little bit whenever that game was on. It just felt like the whole environment, like you said, like Fred was saying, it's just dread, right?
The steps.
The loading screens with the door opening, it's like creaky as
Yes.
hell, and you're like, oh shit, like what's gonna be on the other side of this? You're just terrified.
Yeah, that was my review of this. I was like, I don't like these controls, but the vibes are immaculate.
Yeah.
Like, it was great.
The tank controls, especially now, I mean, they were very revolutionary at the time because I felt like, it was very necessary for the type of environment they were trying to present, right? It's all 3D and you're trying to navigate through this, but playing it in a modern system, you're like, this is extremely frustrating.
Right, because there's games that have that fixed camera, but the controls aren't like that. Like, right?
No.
Yeah, and I've actually read that like when they were making the game, they kind of did experiment with like better controls, but they were like, it was too easy to kill the zombies. Like it didn't like, you don't feel threatened by enemies in the same way. So it's kind of like a design choice, but like as a modern gamer, like that's tough to go back to.
Yeah, it's like make your zombie harder to kill then or something.
Yeah.
Don't make controls worse.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like the game already has a challenge in itself, as I kind of mentioned before, with the ammo limitations
Right.
that you run into. Like, especially when you're facing like a horde of a couple of them in the hallway, and it's like, okay, I just ran out of handgun bullets. All I have is a shotgun, and You're just like, okay, trying to count the shells that you're shooting and wondering where the hell the exit is.
Yeah, it's cool because like one unique thing in the American version of Resident Evil 1 is there's an auto aim feature that's actually disabled for the American release because they didn't want people to rent the game. They wanted to make it hard so you would have to buy it. But like in Japan, renting games wasn't a thing.
Right.
So it was like a little easier in its original Japanese version. But to kind of sell more in the US, they kind of made it more difficult on purpose, which I find kind of interesting. And like renting isn't a thing anymore, but back then, like the effect that it actually had on games that were coming out back then.
Definitely. Like I even heard for Resident Evil 2 that was just like something they were thinking about while developing it. It was like, we don't want people to rent this. Like,
Yeah.
It is crazy just how long the series has been around that like, you're like, oh yeah, renting games was like a problem to game companies trying to make sales back then.
Yeah, and I think if you try to explain that to anybody now of like, of a younger generation about what renting games was like, they'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? Why don't you guys just have your subscription service? Like,
the last game I rented though, 2017.
whoa.
Because we lived in, I almost said Fond du Lac. I did live in Fond du Lac, but when we were living in West Allis, there was still Family Video.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, you still rent games? And I was like, this is kind of cool. It was like $5 to rent a game.
Dang, that's awesome.
So, I mean, this game definitely, I mean, it set a trend, as we talked about thematically. I think it set a trend for the series in terms of what we did. But even one thing, it even kind of went above and beyond was with the remake. So I was kind of curious for it. So what the director's cut you played a director's cut of the original version of the game. Okay.
Which felt like it had the same graphics, because I saw there's like a better graphic version of one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like that. That was $20 on the PlayStation Plus. I was like, too rich for my blood.
Yeah.
But no, it was like the old school version, but probably just had more stuff in it. You know, like more
Gotcha.
scenes and
It's tough though. Yeah, you're right. The controls are definitely a barrier, but I think the way that the fixed camera went through the game, especially when you're talking about like iconic video game scenes, I think everybody talks about like the dogs jumping through the window is like one of like the scariest moments of any video game.
Yeah, Tyrant busting through the tank, like that's another like crazy one.
Right. And it's like all these things that like if you were able to move a camera angle around or something like that, you would not get to experience real time, because it's like half the thing is that you're moving down the hallway, right? And all you're like, holy shit. Like, it's crazy. But yeah, the remake came out. So I think I wrote 2002 down is right. And it came on PlayStation 2 and controlled a lot like Resident Evil 4, which made it like super playable. I mean, and that's the version I play. I've only played one on the PlayStation like for like a minute, whereas like I spent a lot more time with the remake. And yeah, I was so impressed with like the way they updated it.
Yeah, and I think one thing to bring up with one is like the voice acting. I mean, so many iconic lines like Jill Sandwich and Master of Lockpicking. Like I think that's part of the charm though, where it's kind of like campy, like the voice acting is like back then there was limitations of like how they recorded it, but I think that kind of is part of the charm and the vibe of the series, and I think that has carried over, probably not so much with 7 and 8, but kind of through the Umbrella Chronicle type of Resident Evils.
Right. Well, it just added a lot more of a cinematic aspect to a time in games when that was kind of rare. Outside of like you have like an announcer on a game going like Resident Evil or like Tekken 2, you know, and like you don't get as many like things where you do get see and hear the voice acting, especially coming off a generation. This is not too far removed from the Super Nintendo, where like that just wasn't an option.
right.
You know.
Yeah. I just like this game couldn't have been made until the PlayStation 1 came out. I think Fujimura, who made Sweet Home, was like, he was waiting for the right hardware to come out and kind of handpick Shinji Mikami, which obviously turned out to be a Galaxy Brain level move, because you know we're talking about the series 20 something years later.
For sure.
Yeah. No, I mean 1 is revolutionary, but I would say even 2 probably escalated the series into superstardom, right? I think that was, if 1 was kind of announcing like, hey, here's a new game that's kind of changing like what a game can be, 2 is like, okay, here's what Resident Evil can be.
Yep, and that's the game that stands out as like the pop culture of those older games. Resident Evil 2 is like, It's featured in like what I'm trying to think of the Edgar Wright series, Spaced, and like whenever you see Resident Evil, like the old Resident Evils in a movie or something, it's gonna be Resident Evil 2. Like,
Yeah,
it's huge.
it is, and I think it pretty much expanded the world too, and it kind of did the same thing of like if you were to equate Resident Evil 1 to like Arkham Asylum, where you are just kind of going around this like interior area. Suddenly now you have the Arkham City version of it, right? Where you're out in a city and you're getting to see all these zombies out in these different environments, and you're trying to make your way from building to building through the streets of Raccoon City, and it's like it just completely enlarged the scope by like 100 times. Yeah. So Resident Evil came out, or Resident Evil 2 came out in 1998, so 2 years after the arrival of the original, and they had their remake come out a couple years ago in 2019. And the script was handled by Noboru
Sugiyama? Or Sugimura?
Sugimura?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I'm going to butcher this. Who I wrote down was a professional TV writer that they brought in, who had previously worked as a head writer on Super Sentai, which for American audiences would know that better as the inspiration series for Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And also lifted a lot of the footage from there. So, yeah, I mean, he was not only the father of Resident Evil 2 here in terms of developing the story, but also gave us Power Rangers as we know it. So originally he was just hired to help an existing sequel script that was written by Kamiya, but he ultimately requested to do an entire rewrite on the story from start to finish. And
yeah, it's actually interesting because Hideki Kamiya, who Shinji Mikami had picked to direct Resident Evil 2, his original concept, they basically completely scrapped it and kind of had to start from scratch, which was kind of unheard of in game development, just because like it takes so long to make these games, is you can't really just like, spend time building a concept that you're just going to scrap. And it was like completely unrelated to Resident Evil 1. Like the story wasn't supposed to really be connected at all. But yeah, then Sugimura came in and was like, he was a huge fan of Resident Evil 1 and basically was like, how can you like develop a sequel and like not connect it to the main game? Like it's such a missed opportunity. And yeah, they kind of went back to the drawing board and better for it. Like it's just like, when you think of Resident Evil 2 is like probably most of people's favorites, or like it just really resonated with people.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, like we already talked about, like it changed the scope of the whole series. But I think what makes that game resonate so well is that it did connect right back. It's like, okay, you're not just in a haunted house anymore where there's zombies around in the courtyard or anything like that. No, you're in the streets of like, a New York City or something like that, and it's like every turn could be deadly, or everything needs is a challenge to get access just to like the fire department or something, right? So I mean, it's crazy the development history on this entire series, because it seemed like they would just generate all these different ideas, and some of them would just go for nothing. Like,
yeah, it's like a lot of these games they would like generate multiple incarnations of it and kind of like pick the best one.
Yeah.
And I think like 1 and 2 in particular, like Capcom was not like particularly doing well, and they were like, we need to hit a home run to keep the company financially afloat, and they did. Like, yeah, it's like Resident Evils always sell well, especially 1 and 2.
Right. Yeah. And so I mean, the game's story takes place 2 months after the events of the first game. And it's set in Raccoon City, as I mentioned before, which is supposed to kind of be like in a Midwest-ish, like mountain community, kind of like a Denver or something like that, right? And so in this, the residents have all been transformed into zombies by this T-virus, and once again, Umbrella is behind it. I guess we didn't really get into the plot of the first one. I don't know, like, how would we summarize that? Because there's so much lore behind it.
Well, you see, the STARS Team Beta was sent in because STARS Team Alpha went in to check out the raccoon situation Raccoon City situation. There weren't like actual raccoons, but I bet there are zombie raccoons running around.
You would think.
Missed opportunity.
But they show up and they're like, "Wait, what's happened to Alpha? We don't know, but we know they got zombified." And it's just kind of pretty much you're uncovering that this is all a big corporation trying to cover up like an incident involving their like experimentations.
Yeah.
So it's like I think you have the good guys coming in, but then you have these other like people from Umbrella or whatever, and you're like, what is their deal?
Yeah, and I think it's funny that so many years even before I would say that the criticisms on Big Pharma really hit ahead as they have now, that we have a whole game series about a pharmaceutical company, which very appropriately named Umbrella, as many are now, and buying up smaller pharmaceutical companies to become one big oligarchy. But just the fact that it's like they are trying to cover up this conspiracy, or that they let this out into the world, which especially going through a pandemic recently really kind of hits it a little different than even did in 96.
Yeah, it's just interesting, because there's like corrupt people like running the city too, and like looking the other way for Umbrella to conduct their operations, and just like the secret lab that they have underneath the mansion, and it's just kind of was ahead of its time in like commentary on these larger corporations taking advantage of people, which some of the later series, I think, literally like they go a little direct on it, but I think it's such a fascinating lore and kind of just keeps coming up throughout the series.
Yeah, and so we have Albert Wesker, who's kind of like he's part of Stars though, isn't he originally?
So he actually is originally working for Umbrella.
Okay,
he's like a scientist working for Umbrella, but then he leaves and kind of becomes a double agent working for Stars. So
right.
He's like your captain. But he really is kind of manipulating things behind the scenes to the extent we don't really find out until later games.
Yeah.
But he used to work for Umbrella, kind of becomes a double agent working for Stars, and is kind of orchestrating this whole event of having the Stars team infiltrate the mansion to kind of collect data on like how trained combatants would perform against these monsters that Umbrella has created.
Yeah. And so ultimately, Chris and Jill kind of upturn this whole operation and manage to escape the mansion successfully.
Yeah, they blow that shit up, like the rocket launcher at the end. Like that's just iconic. Like you get one tossed from a chopper, and you have to shoot a rocket at a huge monster. That's basically every Resident Evil ending, right there.
Yep.
I suppose we should say, even though for this episode we're gonna be diving into a lot of spoilers. So sorry we didn't give you a heads up if you've had 30 years to play Resident Evil. But yeah, I think so just prepare for that going forward. I think we're gonna just kind of, without much prejudice, just get into spoiler country.
Yeah, and I think I know we jumped back, but if we're kind of focusing on 2, it's also the start of a game function, if you want to call it that stays with the series and gets reinvented, which is the foreboding large boss that can follow you through the map. Mm-hmm. Which I've only played 2 in the remake form for like the PlayStation 4 or 5, whatever, but I'm very curious of what that was like playing on the PlayStation or whatever with that hulking the Tyrant.
Mr. X.
Mr. X.
It's a version of Tyrant called Mr. X that kind of stalks you throughout the game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but was Tyrant? Oh, was he pretty prevalent in Resident Evil 2? Like the original?
He was, I think, to the extent that the remake does it, where he kind of can appear and follow you, just because, like, the AI and the enemies just didn't really behave in that way in RE2. So he's kind of more like he pops up, he's in it, but he's not quite what he is in the remake, which is like terrifying. When you hear those boots clanking behind you, you're like, oh shit, like I gotta get out of here.
Yeah, which I mean, obviously they will escalate to a new level too in the third one, but to focus on 2 again, so basically picking up from those events from the end of 1, we have it's Claire Redfield and Leon Kennedy who gets introduced in this one, Claire being the sister of Chris Redfield from the first one, who are also Stars members, but basically trying to navigate their way through the city and ultimately try to escape a city that is like falling into shambles, like from this virus outbreak here, right? And I think one of the cool things that got developed here that they actually had started developing late in the development of the first game is the idea of zapping, is Kamiya had dubbed it, which basically was the idea of like, rather than having your choices affect the outcome of like each person's story, it's like the narrative is kind of set, and then you can kind of go back and forward between each of the two. So you see like how Claire and Leon's efforts are like impacting the story at large at the same time. And it's something that would persevere then pretty much for, well, most of the games that feature two protagonists, which was not all of them, as we know. But yeah, I think it was pretty revolutionary even for the time. You didn't have a lot of games where you were going between multiple protagonists. Not, at least not that I could think of.
Yeah, I think, Resident Evil 1 had, like, you could kind of pick your own character. And I think 2, being able to pick between Leon and Claire was, like, really interesting as well. Just because, you would kind of, like, intersect with each other. You'd kind of see each other as you go through the series. But yeah, I think, like we were saying, Resident Evil always kind of finds ways to reinvent itself, but kind of, keep those concepts that are core to the series.
Right. Yeah, and it's definitely just a trendsetter, I think, for video games at large. What are some of you guys' memories, though, besides, I guess, the Tyrant obviously is a huge piece of that, where he's kind of following you through, especially in the remake with him being Mr. X. But yeah, with Resident Evil 2, I mean, what are some of the memorable moments or things that you guys are noted about this game?
Well, I think the best thing, the remake is the first remake that they use the RE engine that Capcom built. So it's an internally built engine that Capcom's used in a lot of games, actually. But like, I think it just looks like gorgeous. Like it looks really cool. And yeah, it's just like they do such a good job at kind of using that over the shoulder, especially in the remake, of kind of building up that tension. Mr. X, like, he just pops up at the most inconvenient times, and I think it's just, kind of gets that adrenaline pumping. And
yeah.
And also shout outs to the PC mod community who like they've done mods where like they'll turn Mr. X into like Thomas the Tank Engine, and he'll like pop up behind you. You're like, oh shit, and you got a big ass Thomas face behind you.
Well, I know like you brought up mods. I remember hearing like I think there's a version of like Resident Evil 2 where if you beat it, you can be like a giant piece of tofu.
What?
Yeah, it's like either 1 or 2, and it was because it was their placeholder, when they were trying to do like spatial testing. They used this big piece of tofu, and apparently that was something that you could play as.
Wow.
It was like a secret unlockable thing.
Wow, that's wild. Yeah, it is a element of Resident Evil 2, it looks like. But this is hilarious. It's just like like he's wearing got like a police hat and a baton. It's just a piece of tofu. It's standing in the middle of the street. That's amazing. Well, that's from the remake though too, but it's pretty funny to see that. Yeah, I think 2 had a lot of interesting story elements too. I remember just like, certainly 1 introduces the idea that like you're gonna run across a lot of like characters that like you're befriending and they die, but it's just sort of like you're trying to like solve these puzzles too. And I think that's an element too that we really get into with 1, but just the fact that it is a survival horror and that it's almost kind of like the grandfather of the escape room games, right? Of like, you need to find this key to get through this door, or you need, in Resident Evil 2, you need to go talk to the dude who's locked himself in the prison cell, right? In order to get through the other door in the building. And like, there's just so many like different ways that you had to think laterally beyond the fact that you're just shooting zombies, right? Like, there's so many different elements to this game that define what survival horror is. Yeah, and and it really did set the trend for a lot of different games in the series. I think going forward, Resident Evil 2 kind of feels like, again, sort of announced what Resident Evil, the series, was going to be moving forward. I don't know. Any other thoughts on 2, though?
Came on 2 discs. That's pretty crazy.
2 discs?
Yeah, 2 discs.
Oh, man.
Move over, Final Fantasy
The
VII.
Metal Gear Solid. That's what I would think of.
Was Metal Gear Solid was on 2 discs? Wow. And the 2 discs for Resident Evil 2 was one was like for
one was
Claire,
Leon,
and then one
was
was for
Claire.
Leon.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you remember people making a big deal out of that?
I will say, since we're kind of talking about the remakes as we're talking about the like entries, and I don't want to jump ahead because this isn't really like saying my rankings or anything, but I will say I think that remake of 2, they spent more time than they did on any of the other remakes on just fleshing out the like backgrounds in the rooms, because 4 is great and it looks good, but I still think 2 is the best looking of these remakes. I think maybe the smaller space, maybe because it's been around for so long, they could tinker with it more.
Yeah.
Maybe because it wasn't as evolved, they could make more, choices with it. But I think that's like one of the best looking games is the Resident Evil 2 remake.
I mean, if you look at the graphics too, yeah, you definitely see how far it's come. I think Joe mentioned too that it's on the new engine. And I think they were trying to make like a kind of an announcement too of like, here's what we can do with this, right? And it's a beautiful game. So as far as the story, because I think it's relevant to where 3 picks up, because that's very integral to it. So the whole idea, right, is that Chris is obviously involved in the series, but it is Claire. Claire Redfield. Just going to say Redfield, and you can fill in the gap. So they are trying to escape the city, right? And so they encounter William Birkin, right? Who is kind of the creator of like the advanced virus.
William Birkin is kind of betrayed by Umbrella, and he gets attacked, and he ends up injecting himself to kind of fight back against Umbrella. One of the things that happens during that encounter is like the rats kind of like get into the samples that he kind of spills on the ground, which, as you're saying, like kind of ties into 3 and like Raccoon City just like being completely infected. And like the first part of Resident Evil 3 like takes place before 2, which is like interesting because like the stories are so tightly connected. But yeah, that's kind of how William Birkin gets involved along with his wife and his daughter in the series.
Right. Yeah, and then, so as we were saying, so in Resident Evil 3, if we even want to start touching on that story, so yeah, this one follows, it's Jill, right? Jill Valentine's back from the first one?
Yeah, Jill's in 3.
So it kind of follows, like, connects how she got to Raccoon City before the events of the second game, and then later on it picks up after the events of the second game. So we're kind of seeing Jill's perspective through all these things.
And it's super clear when you play the third one that that's going on.
I could sense the sarcasm.
Well, like until recently, like I said, I've played the majority of these games, and I didn't know what the hell was going on. Now that we've been doing research, been watching a lot of like recaps, and I'm definitely more familiar with it. But before I was playing it, I'm like, I know the gist, Umbrella bad,
Yeah.
no good, and yeah, I'm just like I was struggling. Like I don't know who these people are in relation to each other, or what they want, or who they work for. But I'm having a good time.
Yeah, so it's definitely, I mean, as much as they are connected, yes, they definitely add a whole lot of layers to the lore. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, this has just come down to, like, Umbrella has fucked over a lot of people, and they're all kind of doing things in their own way, either to try and get back in good graces with them, or to get back at them.
Yeah,
Right.
Umbrella bad, Stars good.
Yeah, there we go. I like it.
Yeah.
But stars can sometimes be bad, right?
Oh shit, that's right, Wesker.
Talk about Krieger.
Not all
right?
stars.
Yeah, not all stars are stars. So Resident Evil 3, which was subtitled Nemesis, was first released in 1999, so just a year after the development of number 2. So as soon as Resident Evil 2 was clear that became a success, Capcom, they had already greenlit a third one after the first one, but then they were kind of slow playing the production a little bit. But really, once it was resonated that like 2 was going to be a hit, they were like, okay, we got to get 3 in progress. They actually greenlit 2 other games too at the same time. So it was Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil 0, which takes place before the first game, and then Resident Evil Code Veronica, which was sort of just like a parallel story, right? To the timing of 3, maybe a little after.
It takes place after.
Yeah.
Yeah, and 0 is another one that PlayStation has, like most of these games in PlayStation Plus. They want money for 0.
Ooh.
which is the one that looked good to me, even though people say is bad.
My biggest issue with Zero, and I know we're not quite there yet, because we will talk a little about Zero, but the tank controls are still there, and
Yeah.
oh god,
I would say it's ripe for a remake. Let's remake Resident Evil 0.
yeah,
Coulda, woulda, shoulda. We gotta save those.
I gotta say, don't show you
Much
the hand.
like the Resident Evil series, we're kind of jumping around, we're doing a little take here, but we're going to follow up the tape from the beginning, we're mixing it up.
Yeah, we're definitely kind of just jumping around because I think the story and the development kind of mandates that we do it because this is basically how they approached it. And in fact, I mean, part of the thing with 3 was that they weren't sure about how the story was going to come together for 2 because obviously it was in production already. So they had to kind of rewrite what was going to happen in 3 because Jill Valentine wasn't even supposed to be the main character. It was supposed to be Claire Redfield back, but because like they implied that Jill is going to be around again, they're like, oh, I guess we put Jill in the front of this.
Well, I think it's also because Claire and Chris were going to be in Code Veronica, so it's like, well, we can't have her in 3 and Code Veronica at the same time.
Right.
An interesting thing about the development of 3 is they kind of knew the PlayStation 2 is coming, so they kind of wanted the Resident Evil game on there, but they couldn't really wait that long for a game to come out, so Resident Evil 3 actually started as like a side game. Like it wasn't supposed to be a numbered game. But like throughout the game, it showed a lot of promise. They wanted to use Jill in it. And eventually put a number on it, which was kind of a big deal because like 3, I think when you compared to the other games, like it's a lot shorter. Like you don't really think of it as like the same length as like 2 or 4. And that's really because of its origins as starting as more of like a side game and not necessarily a numbered entry in the franchise. But eventually they made it one, and yeah, it's really cool. Like the nemesis that stalks you, it's like the origins of Mr. X in the RE2 remake.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's so funny too. Yeah, that we go looks like the remakes go back to the sequels to find inspiration and how they're gonna go forward.
Because like the plot of 3 feels like it's a side game, not like in like I'm not in a mean way, but because it sandwiches 2. Like usually you wouldn't think your next sequel is a sandwich of 2. Like it's getting very like Rogue One.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly as we were saying that it was originally intended as a standalone expansion from 2. But rather than doing an entire new setting with new cast and anything, Mikami and then newcomer Kazuhiro Aoyama, they agreed to go with Jill Valentine and made her the protagonist of the game. And I think I might have mixed this up before, but to clarify, so Jill Valentine was going to be in Code Veronica, but when they made the decision, or when they found out that like Claire Redfield was going to survive 2, they were like, well, Claire can just be in Code Veronica, and that way we don't have the same protagonist of both of the games.
Right.
So they're kind of sharing the wealth, and then they're creating a cast that perseveres them throughout the rest of these games. And then so in this game, Jill is attempting to escape Raccoon City while being tracked down by Nemesis. And it's divided into 2 parts, we mentioned. First half takes place a day before the events of Resident Evil 2, and then the second half occurs 2 days after the conclusion of 2. And it basically just kind of expands on, like you're saying, the settings that we saw in 2 with Raccoon City, and kind of provides a conclusion to what happens to the people in the city itself. It's not a good thing.
No, Umbrella bad. Let's
Umbrella
remember
bad.
that. Umbrella bad.
Umbrella
Shouldn't do it.
Stars good. Jill
Stars
good.
good.
This star's good.
Stars, as Nemesis says. So the whole idea then is, right, Nemesis was once a Stars member, right?
Well, I think he was programmed to hunt stars.
But wasn't his like the person that becomes, or I might be
You're thinking of the movies.
I think I'm thinking of the movie, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the plot lines in the movies. In the game, I mean, he's like another version of the Tyrant, and he is programmed to hunt stars, which is why he's always yelling about stars. But yeah, the game kind of starts, Jill kind of dealing with a little PTSD from her incident in Resident Evil 1.
Yeah.
And yeah, she's got Nemesis hunting her as she tries and escapes the city because it's about to be bombed by the government because they're just like, oh shit, like we got to cover all this up and get rid of the virus.
Perhaps there'll be a countdown of some sorts.
Maybe.
But I think one of the cool things about 3 is that, you know, Jill is a female protagonist and the only protagonist in this game, which back then felt like a pretty big deal just because, you know, it was usually just like a bunch of dudes that would normally serve as the heroes of each game. I know 1 and 2, you had Claire and Jill, but kind of giving her own game, I thought felt was really cool. And I think kind of iconic, like her like outfit in the game. Like it's like very memorable. And she's like one of the most popular. The cover, yeah. And I think it's just like, yeah, it's Jill has been a mainstay. Like she's in like the Marvel vs. Capcom games. She makes appearances everywhere.
Yeah. And it's, I think you make a good point too, because at that time, I think really the only other games would have like a very prominent female protagonist was maybe like Tomb Raider.
Yeah, Tomb Raider.
And even then, it felt like
It's a bit oogly.
Yeah, I was going to say, they kind of objectify Lara Croft a bit, which was sort of the whole idea with getting Angelina Jolie, right, as in the live action. But, yeah, and I think it's cool, too. Yeah, even with Code Veronica, they did the same thing. I know we're going to be talking about that next, but just the idea that they are putting these female protagonists that they've had at the forefront and really changing the game a bit, ultimately, you know, it sets the tone, I think, for that you can have kind of a bunch of different people leading the story. It doesn't revolve around, you know, like one person, not John Wick every movie, right? Or every installment. It can be a totally different person in this world. So what were you guys' thoughts then on 3, knowing that you kind of pick up off of Tyrant coming after you, Fred, and now you got Nemesis coming after you?
Well, to be honest, I rented 2 and 3, or not rented. I bought from the PlayStation Store 2 and 3 like back to back, so it kind of feels like one whole game to me. So I didn't feel any of the criticism about the length because I think I literally like rolled credits on 2 and I was like, all right, and 3. So I had no like I didn't feel shorter or anything. I think at least in the remake, it was nice to introduce the who's the other character in 3?
Carlos?
I like Carlos a lot, and he also has kind of higher power weaponry, which I feel was a little newer. I'm guessing because 2 has some of that, but not like 3.
Yeah, like automatic weapons and stuff. They start introducing more in 2 and 3, which I think was just like kind of like the more like we want to make it more like a Hollywood movie or something, where like action, like give people like higher powered guns and whatnot.
Yeah, and it's and Carlos, spoiler alert, he gets the drop on Nemesis, right? Doesn't he the one that shoots the rocket launcher that explodes?
Yeah, he shoots him. I think he saves Jill like a ton of times. And yeah, another series villain that gets defeated by a rocket launcher. Resident Evil classic.
I mean, it's almost better to count how many games do you not beat the boss with the rocket launcher?
I think 7 and 8 are probably the
Probably
ones.
you don't.
Yeah.
8 ends really actiony, but I don't know if you get a rocket launcher.
Yeah.
Like 8's like, oh, we're doing this now, which I like.
Yeah.
But
It's on its bullshit.
yeah. I was like, ooh, it's letting its hair down. I like it.
Yeah. But I think, I mean, maybe in today, you would see Nemesis more, and I'm talking about the game itself, not just the character, would maybe be just a DLC for another game, like a very chunky DLC, kind of like Phantom Liberty with Cyberpunk recently, right? Where it's almost like a whole other segment of the same story, even though it's kind of standalone in hindsight. So we've been talking a little bit about Code Veronica, but the 4th game in the series was Code Veronica. So that was finally released in the year 2000, so the year after Resident Evil 3. Later re-released for Dreamcast as an updated form. But by October 1998, so ideas were rapidly changing. We talked about the idea that they had planned it to be Jill, replaced her with Claire when it was clear that Claire was going to survive the ending of 2. And basically they wanted to just kind of capitalize on that right away and be like, well, okay, rather than feature one protagonist, let's have the other person kind of step in here. And the game is set 3 months after the events of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, following Claire and Chris in their efforts to survive the outbreak in a remote prison island in the Southern Ocean, in a research facility in Antarctica. Capcom. Antarctica. So the game retains a lot of the traditional survivor horror controls and gameplay of the previous installments, but unlike the pre-rendered backgrounds of the previous games, they use completely real-time 3D environments and dynamic camera movement, so adding some new perspectives to the series. Now, what are you guys' thoughts on Code Veronica? Have you either of you played it?
I have played it, and I think one of the things that stands out to me about this is that it was originally made for Dreamcast, which, I was a huge Dreamcast guy. Like, I loved my Dreamcast. As a Street Fighter fan, like, tons of classic entries on that, like Sonic, tons of other Capcom games.
Yep.
I think it was interesting that they released it for Dreamcast and then eventually ported it to PS2 because obviously the Dreamcast wasn't that successful.
I love Dreamcast.
I love Dreamcast. Let's bring Dreamcast back. I think the cool thing was, like you get to play as Claire, but another thing, like I'd mentioned before, where kind of characters will get sidelined for multiple entries. Like Chris comes back, Wesker comes back, and he's like a huge part of the story, which I thought was really cool. Plus just like kind of the creepy vibe of like the enemies you encounter, like the Ashcroft family with like the brother and the sister. And yeah, it's just kind of really playing up on the creepy vibes.
Yeah, and I think in the development, what I read was that they originally had planned these to be like the Krieger family or something, or Kruger family, and they're going to be like this German family, but they ultimately decided for sort of like more of a British like aristocracy type family, which is, I don't know.
This is the start of Western Gothic horror, I feel, really getting injected into the series, which is huge in it now.
Yeah, and I think that I remember when Code Veronica came out, like, the big deal about it was how graphically beautiful the game was. Like, everybody was like, look at what these engines can do now. Because, like, obviously 1, 2, and 3 were big deals. And, everybody was raving about how creepy they were and how, exciting the story was and how difficult some of these games were. But I felt like Code Veronica was the first one where it was like, man, this really looks good. But I have not played Code Veronica, and I don't know much about it, to be honest. Yeah, so...
Yeah,
it is streaming on PlayStation.
Oh, shit. PlayStation Plus?
Yeah.
Maybe.
I do
many games.
I do think that's pretty common, though, even as like people that are fans of the franchise, just because it did originally come out on the Dreamcast. I know Code Veronica X, which was like an enhanced version of it, came out on PS2, but I think when you're not like the first console to release on, you kind of get lost in the shuffle a little bit. Which is just a shame. I mean, like you're saying, like, they increased like the graphical fidelity of the game, like the story is really interesting. Code Veronica happens before? No, just kidding. It actually happens after 3. But yeah, the main villains, the Ashcroft family, are actually their grandfather was one of the founders of the Umbrella Corporation, and we all know
Umbrella Bad.
Umbrella Bad.
And yeah, so kind of Claire gets entangled with them and eventually has to call for help from her brother Chris, Big Bro Chris, and he comes and helps. And you eventually encounter Wesker is also there because he's interested in the new strain of the virus the Ashcroft family has come up with. Because at this point, Wesker is basically playing Pokemon with all the various viruses that are prevalent in the world of Resident Evil. So he's got to kind of he gets into the story because he wants to get the virus, and you actually find out that he is like an enhanced human now because he injected himself with the virus, and that's kind of how he survived Resident Evil 1. and he's just kind of starts becoming this kind of superhuman, and kind of is the main antagonist of the series, or one of the main antagonists from the series from that point forward.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think this game is something that will definitely come up in my coulda, woulda, shoulda, but I'll save that for later.
Okay. It's like, and he's pretty iconic. I think his look too. I mean, we talked about how good that actor looked in the opening of the first one, but Wesker with his like sunglasses and his like bleach blonde hair,
The red eyes behind the sunglasses is just
Yeah.
it's an iconic villain. I think he's one of the better ones in like video games in general, like one of the more iconic ones at least.
he was kind of at a time I felt like where, and I think in the X-Files we saw it too, but it's like the creepy agent, like sort of who's like watching the protagonist, right? And he's always kind of like manipulating things behind the scenes. He always just manages to show up at those times, and I think that's what makes him so powerful. But yeah, I think it is a time when you're talking about with like gothic horror coming into games too, and it's something that I feel like Resident Evil really started taking on and wanting to keep elaborating on. We see it come back in 4 and 8, where we get a lot more of that in the future, and it's just, it adds, I think, a different vibe that I like a lot of, because it reminds me of like Dracula and like the older like Universal horror movies.
For sure.
Yeah. So Resident Evil 0 was kind of the third part of those trio of games that were in development following 2. And so this one is set before the events of the first Resident Evil, as we mentioned, and in this one you get control of some members of Bravo team, which was Rebecca Chambers, and as well as Billy Cohen, who was a convict who was trying to escape execution, but was wasn't he on the train in this?
He was on the train.
Yeah. So split up from the rest of the team. So Rebecca stumbles upon this zombie-infested train, which is called the Ecliptic Express. Say that 10 times
Ecliptic
fast.
Express.
As part of an abandoned training facility for employees of the Umbrella Company. So she teams up with Billy, and the two try to uncover the source of this infestation they have found on this this train, which is eventually what we find as part of this experimentation that Umbrella is doing. And so this is another one where it allows you to swap between protagonists, but the other one's being controlled by AI, so it can help you solve puzzles. And it kind of reminds me of, do you guys remember the game Lost Vikings?
No. Please tell us, Tom.
No, I mean, I think that game is a Blizzard game, I believe. Early one, but basically the idea is like you are 3 Vikings who get lost in all these worlds, and you have to solve puzzles by like constantly switching between them and like opening doors that the other one can't access. Like that's that type of game, and I felt like it's a cool thing to add that to a 3D environment. Yeah. So what were some thoughts on 0? Have you guys all played this?
I have played 0. I never beat 0. I think it came out on GameCube. Kind of a interesting time because I was like, it's kind of more into like multiplayer games at that point. I was playing my Smash Bros. Smasher with my bros. But I think it is, just cool how throughout the series they kind of explore different timelines. Like this is before like that squad that got lost that Delta Team and Resident Evil 1 is trying to find. Like that's where Rebecca's from. So that's pretty cool that they kind of tie that back in and find opportunities to keep expanding the lore in different ways.
Yeah, and you are correct. It was GameCube, November of 2002. I don't think I said that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's cool that they decided to kind of show where it all started, right? Like sort of like, hey, this is what set off the whole chain of events that cascaded into what we now know is like the main plot line, so to speak. But obviously that will change following this game. But yeah, a very cool idea. I think there's not enough games that will dive into prequels. Metal Gear Solid was one, but yeah, I can't think of too many other games where you go back to the start. And I think 0 was one that I found when I had PlayStation Now, and that was the subscription service that just lets you kind of like stream whichever game. And I think I started playing. I got on the train, and I was still having to like turn very intentionally, and I lost my mind. I was like, I cannot play this game. Like it's just too much. Especially because this game came out around the same time as that Resident Evil remake, like the first remake. So it was like, why did one continue to use the other engine that they clearly were trying to completely solve. And then Master, as far as we got into Resident Evil 4, which finally strays a bit from the main plot line. So Resident Evil 4, I think, is maybe the most critically well-received installment in the series.
Oh, for sure. I mean,
Definitely.
I think 4 is one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time. And I mean, it's just excellent.
Yeah, it has a case for, I think, being one of the best games ever. I mean, despite earlier announcements in its cycle that it was going to be released on PlayStation 2, there were 4 different iterations of the game that ended up getting scrapped. One of which resulted in another very popular Capcom game, and one I'm sure that Joe would love to talk about someday, Devil May Cry.
Hell yeah. I think Hideki Kamiya, who directed Resident Evil 2, kind of always leaned more towards action games. And I think with Resident Evil 4, he was kind of developing the first incarnation of it. And then Shinji Mikami was like, wait, this is like too action-y. Like, this doesn't really like have the survival horror kind of gene that all the other games had.
Yeah.
Which eventually, Devil May Cry came out of that. And that's one of the most popular ones. And I mean, Kamiya's made like Beautiful Joe and Bayonetta. And obviously he has kind of like that more action style and can definitely like make those types of games.
Yep. But yeah, and then so Mikami decided to make the series exclusive for GameCube, this Resident Evil 4. So while Devil May Cry moved forward on PlayStation 2, he brought this only to GameCube, and the game was released on January 11th, 2005. Recently, we saw the remake released in March 24th of 2023. And basically, he commissioned the script of his own and worked with Satoshi Yoshimatsu to create a story that was set after the collapse of Umbrella that could kind of stand on its own and really separate itself from this whole main storyline. But while doing that, bringing back another favorite character with Leon Kennedy, who now worked for a government agency in one of their original drafts. But in the final version of the game, then, Leon is instead assigned to an unnamed agency that has a direct line to the President of the United States. So he's given the job in the game to protect or find and save the daughter of the President in a small village in the middle of Spain. So basically you go through that. You're supposed to save the president's daughter, Ashley Graham. Everybody who's played this knows Ashley's name.
Something my wife was struggling with the past few weeks. Just like, Ashley! She peeks her head in. What's going on?
Fred, how are you teaching the game to yell? So she's been kidnapped by a religious cult in this area in Spain, and Leon has to go through all these hordes. This time, instead of the T virus, they are infected by a mind-controlling parasite that is La Plaga.
Las Plagas.
And it's found in amber,
Amber.
like Jurassic Park.
It's in your blood.
Life finds a way.
Life finds a way. So this one also sees the return of Ada Wong from Resident Evil 2, who was presumed dead in that game, right?
Yeah, she kind of like fell down a pit, and then you don't know what happened to her.
Yeah, but she pops back up.
She back.
So the big thing in this game then was that a departure from the fixed camera angles that we've gotten so used to in the previous games, and now it was the over-the-shoulder third-person view as he's kind of going through this world. And I mean, the game itself is just, it's extremely playable, is the way I would put it, right? So we've all played and beaten a version of Resident Evil 4, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
As of today.
As of today. So, yeah, I guess kick us off. What are your thoughts on Resident Evil 4 overall then, Fred, since you are fresh off of it?
I liked it a lot. This is something I was really looking forward to playing. I was going to revisit a couple years ago, but then they made the second remake or third remake, and I'm like, they're gonna make the fourth one. Like, there's no question this is gonna happen. So I've been kind of sitting on this game. I had played it at friends' houses where I didn't have enough time to like really invest, but I have played the beginning of 4 probably like 20 times at like different people's houses, just like that first initial village. I have played so many times, so it was great to actually like hunker down and play the whole thing because I really enjoyed that. It almost reminded me of like playing an Uncharted game because it had almost so many different set pieces and settings versus you're all in one police station or you're in city streets. Like this like has a lot of different, even though it's in the same area, location styles, like from castles to small homes to dungeons, like it's pretty cool.
It is cool, and I think what's nice is that it has a more open world feel, even if it is pretty linear, right?
Yeah, and I think the switch to the over the shoulder camera perspective was just like, I mean, the roots of that are still in the remakes, and that's kind of how timeless I think the gameplay that 4 inspired is. Just kind of the dynamic in the combat too, where it's like, oh shit, I can like push over a cabinet and block a window, or like kick over a ladder and like the enemies can't come up and get me. And just like these cool additions that they made to the combat and the environment that I think just like made it feel very dynamic, but also still kind of had that classic Resident Evil tension of like I need my ammo. I need like to conserve my herbs and first aid sprays, and I think just like the different locations, the pacing, like it's just the best.
Yeah,
this is just my favorite entry in the series.
Yeah, I mean it's a breath of fresh air, I think too. When even though we're using a familiar character in this game, the idea that like you didn't necessarily need to know anything about the story to date, it was very much a brand new, fresh installment, and say like, hey. If you've never played one before, you can grab this game. We'll give you all you need to know about Leon and like little tidbits. And other than that, you're just kind of on this journey. And it's just adding a lot of like new characters that are fun. And I mean, the merchant is one that comes up. And other podcasts, we won't do any more impressions of that because the bit has been done.
But another thing that I heard people say, "What are you buying?" and not know what it was from for the longest time. And then like when it all clicked in, I was like, "Oh, this is what it's from.
Yeah.
Oh, this is what it is."
The merchant, yeah.
Yes. And I love, I don't know if this was in the original game, but I love putting my jewels in some different pieces of treasure and selling it to the merchant. That's fun. Give me a whole game of just like making treasure like that.
Yeah, it's like I need to get the same color jewels to like insert. I got the square slots and the circle slots. Got to make sure I got my jewels right.
Yeah, right. I know, and it's like there's so many elements to this game. You're just trying to find any coin you can at the end. You're like, I need more rockets. Like,
the weapon upgrades. I feel like you could kind of like. I think the cool thing about Resident Evil is, I think in a lot of modern games, like. You'll find a gun, and like that's the gun you always use.
Yeah.
Where in Resident Evil, you're like, I have a use for my handgun, I have a use for my shotgun, I have a use for like my SMG. So like you can kind of upgrade the gun that you really like. Like for me, I'm a handgun guy, so I'm like, boom, I'm like upgrading my handgun, like I'm using that thing all the time.
Yeah.
Like I'm getting all these like new weapons. I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna go back to my handgun, like my default gun. That's my favorite one.
Which I messed up towards the end. There was this gun that the merchant had, and I thought it was a pistol or and it shot like regular bullets, but it was a Magnum gun. So I sold my pistol.
Oh no!
And I had a Magnum, which you can't get bullets anywhere in this game for a Magnum.
No.
So I ended up beating the game with like a Magnum and an SMG, and it took forever at the end, but it was tough. But I have a question about the merchant. Now, is it a new voice? Do you know if it's a new voice in the new one?
It is a new voice.
He sounds like Idris Elba.
Yeah, it is a new voice in the remake. They did recast him.
Like, even my wife said, like, it sounds like Idris Elba, but it's like Idris Elba and Luther. That's what it sounds like. Just really putting, like, the Cockney accent on there.
I
Like,
want you to put the word back. The word back up.
like he said, my favorite thing the merchant says every time is like, "Oh, I think we're beginning to develop your taste."
I love it. Yeah, no, that they made a big deal about that. I think a lot of people were pretty upset they recast that voice. Again, a bit that's been done elsewhere, so we won't dive too far into that. But I always liked what's the little guy's name? He's like, Mr. Kennedy.
Oh, Salazar.
Yeah,
yeah.
Salazar Slytherin, you got him. trying to set up
Mr. Kennedy.
Raul?
Raul. That's the bad guy, like the main villain.
Oh,
right?
that's the little. I thought that's the little guy you were talking.
Oh, is it Raul?
Raul Salazar.
I thought his name was something like that.
Do they change the name too?
I don't know. I just thought Raul. I was like, this guy doesn't look like a Raul to me.
Yeah.
Ramon Salazar.
Ramon, that's it.
Ramon.
And
There
you
it
were
is.
like his outfit. We're seeing more like they're going towards the gothic and like the castle. Like more of those vibes coming in.
It really, it definitely capitalized on what kind of got set up in Code Veronica, and I think it feels good because you feel like you're entering a whole another like level of the game when you finally get into like the castle, right? And like you're moving through there. But yeah, it's a fun game that I think has persevered for great reasons, and that it's the fact that I think it just started playing like something that felt familiar to other games without necessarily being untrue to what Resident Evil was about, which obviously was such a smashing success for Capcom. That's not even saying it the same way.
I don't know where it's going now.
It's evolved.
We recast the Capcom guy.
Capcom. So Resident Evil 5 then was announced pretty much immediately following the release of Resident Evil 4. And the development occurred from 2004 to 2008. And the project was pretty ambitious in that it was relying on a lot of international outsourcing to help build like the motion capture and the cinematics and the music for the game. And eventually it was released in March 2009, so 4 years after Resident Evil 4 came out. And it was available this time for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 instead of just the GameCube. So the plot involved an investigation of a terrorist threat by a Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance agents that were investigating it. It's Chris Redfield back and Shiva Alomar in the area of, I'm hopefully not saying this wrong, is it Kajuju?
Kajuju, yeah. I think that's the first village that Chris kind of goes to and kicks off the game.
So this one then takes place in West Africa, which is a element of the game that I think has not aged super well.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the first thing to talk about with RE5 is, we kind of mentioned with RE1 kind of some of the kind of this evil corporation type of concepts where it kind of feels a little more innovative, whereas 5, I think they go in the completely opposite end of the spectrum where it's like, you're in, this African village just like shooting all these people that have been infected, and it just is like, I think could have been the opportunity to maybe have like a more smart commentary on like how Umbrella manipulates things and like how just companies in general kind of take advantage of, people that are in the desperate need of help, which is unfortunate. I think is kind of 5 and 6, I think, kind of start leaning more towards that direction just because I think they're really upping the ante as far as like the action goes and like the huge blockbuster. And I think it's just kind of something that needs to be discussed with 5 and 6 just because I think there's things that they did to kind of appeal to more Western audiences, but definitely needed kind of a smarter hand in kind of guiding some of that stuff.
Yeah,
definitely.
Kind of took the wrong lessons from 4, where they were like, oh, well, here you're in a village with people who don't speak English, but it's also like, but it's a colonization country. It's like, there's maybe a little more passive like commentary on that too, of like, well, it was just more the vibe setting rather than like being like, here, let's look at a low impoverished area and try it.
And it's just like when you're playing it, that's more when it hits you in the wrong way. It's because like the idea of like, oh yeah, there's definitely pharmaceutical companies that are taking advantage of these countries like who are war torn, and have a lot of stuff going on. Like that is a, for lack of a better word, interesting story to tell. But at the end of the day, when you're just like mowing down, a bunch of like Africans and you're this white, like muscly dude, like it's definitely not a good look.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, and, separate from that, the story mostly follows about Chris, is finally confronting Wesker again. And in this time, Jill Valentine? Sheesh.
Oh, man.
So the gameplay was pretty similar to 4, and through the first series, it actually, as Fred mentioned earlier, developed the co-op play, which was a big draw for people because this was a time when I felt like online play was really starting to take off.
That was huge, and co-op was huge too. Like, I mean, I love co-op games, and I think as far as the gameplay goes, like, it is like it's very unfortunate the severe issues with the story is that like it's like one of my favorites to play and have fun with just because it is co-op. It does lose that tension and horror element just because like playing with someone, I think you're going to lose that feeling of isolation, which is kind of the direction that they had picked, I think, with 5 and 6. But yeah, it was like just finding new ways to kind of change up their system of like having multiple main characters in the game.
Yeah, again, I think as a situation where they took a lot of the wrong lessons from the previous game, right? Where it was like, okay, we want to make this more action oriented, but then they're losing sort of that horror element, and that's what Resident Evil is.
Yeah, at that point it's kind of like Left 4 Dead or something, which I love, but just a different game. And I think the co-op is a thing I always remember from Resident Evil 5, that once you've beaten it, you have these lists of levels that you can jump in at any place and be like, oh, I want to do this one. Let's co-op and just play this. And they didn't have that sort of like, because it felt more of like just a story. And it does have a story that you can follow, and it's very action-packed and a blockbuster. But to me, this is the most like pick up and play with a friend of any of the games that I played, at least.
So with this one then, so Umbrella not quite back in the picture, but just sort of maybe like the legacy of Umbrella is getting picked up a bit?
Yeah, because I mean, Wesker is the primary antagonist, and I think it's more kind of like I was alluding to, where he's been trying to capture or like research all the various strains, like RE4, the Las Plagas, like he's like researched that. Code Veronica, like the new strain of the virus there, and he's kind of picking up the legacy of Umbrella, and kind of has this goal of kind of turning, I guess, evolving the human race in very classic bad dude style. And it's kind of like he's been developing this new virus, and is like the boss at the end, and the antagonist for the game.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, and I think it's definitely one that it tried to do different things, and I think it can be commended for that. But I think it definitely the feedback after that release, remember, was pretty negative overall. And it definitely has a lot of detractors. I think for 5, I think there were still people that were like pretty positive on it. I do think it's like very cool in like its conclusion to the Umbrella type of storyline, and like Wesker, like we mentioned, is like a really cool character, and like his story comes to a conclusion in this game. So I think from like the kind of fan servicey like element of being huge fans of the characters, I think 5 did a good job at that. But I think just very mixed, because it loses a lot of the survival horror elements and like the things that like kind of made Resident Evil. Yeah, right. But then 6 kind of picks up more on the gameplay, though, a little bit more.
Yeah, so 6, I think, kind of... It's interesting how 6 came about, just because I think it was definitely another attempt for Capcom to try and appeal to Western audiences. But I think they went way too far in that direction and kind of, lost the plot with what made Resident Evil. Yeah.
Which I think definitely, I mean, a lot of games have fallen into this trap too, where you've gone through, and I think Final Fantasy is definitely one I've thought about too, where it seems like it fell in love with a lot of the new innovations they brought into themselves, and they were like, okay, let's try and keep going down this thread. When it's like, what I loved though was the older stuff. Like I felt like they do so much of like the cyberpunk theme now, and now it's like, okay, now I kind of want to go back to like the medieval age. So Resident Evil 6 was released in October 2012 and was conceptualized soon after the release of 5. Entered full development though in 2009. This development of the game was led by Hiroyuki Kobayashi, who was brought in by Capcom to be deliver the most impressive Resident Evil ever in terms of scope and production value.
That's what I think of 6. I don't know. I've only played like maybe an hour of it, and I just decided it wasn't for me. Although I was excited playing it because it was the first one where you could move and shoot.
Yeah, right. So I mean, this one was also brought back zombies finally to the last one, because I think everyone agreed that was kind of the most popular component of the series. Kobayashi admitted that the game had radically changed at the end of the development cycle due to a lot of the new concepts it introduced to the series. So even though it brings back Leon and Chris Redfield, Ada Wong, and then we have the character of Jake Muller, who are kind of confronting this force behind this worldwide bioterrorist attack. The story is kind of centered around their interwoven campaigns as they try and stop it. And it's pretty action heavy, right?
I feel
super
they
action-heavy.
took a lot of the stuff that didn't work from 5 and made it more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it kind of just goes to, I think we've mentioned this, where there's deliberate choices made in how you control Resident Evil that makes it unique and like keeps that like scary element. And when you just make it like a Call of Duty kind of style shooter, you lose all that. So like 6, yeah, you can mow down all these enemies, but like you're not scared. You don't feel like you're rationing your ammo. You don't feel like, you're looking for green herbs around every corner. It just
Yeah.
like kind of loses the plot in how it tried to, keep ramping up the action, which, that's not Resident Evil.
Yeah.
And it was like definitely had a pretty negative reception when it came out.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was getting to. I was like, despite bringing all these things back, and all these like popular characters back, it felt like, it just didn't hit the right thing. Like,
Yeah, there's like too many characters. Like Jake turns out to be like the son of Wesker, and then like Sherry Birkin, who's the daughter of William Birkin from Resident Evil 2, comes back, and it's
Yeah.
like they just have this huge like cast of characters, which is cool, but the story then loses its tightness, and you don't really know what's going on.
yeah.
I think there's some really bad. What's that? Where you have to hit a button at a certain time?
Oh, like quick time events.
Quick time event.
Yeah,
There's a lot of those that suck in that one. I remember.
That's rough. But yeah, I mean, and I think it was kind of a tempo setter for Capcom, or and the Resident Evil developers to be like, or maybe just sort of being like, hey, you know what you're doing isn't necessarily going over well here. And so they decided to go the complete opposite direction for the next installment of the series. So I was going to bring this up earlier, but I also read that this also used the new RE engine. This was Resident Evil 7, which had the subtitle of Biohazard. So a little nod to the Japanese name of it. Not that we didn't have a lot to say about 6, but I think accepting that it's not a great entry and that 5 and 6 are kind of problematic in different ways, don't know that we want to spend too much time on them. So, but Biohazard is Resident Evil 7 in this case. Basically decided to really shake up what they were doing as far as the whole series and really get back to that survival horror element. And in this case, they decided to go more with the first-person shooter idea, and basically took a lot of inspiration from a little movie that I like to talk about called The Evil Dead. So basically, they scaled it back from being like this open-world, action-oriented thing more to a one location. Use the first-person perspective to really immerse players back into the horror element. Even guy has like little elements of Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
It's very Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah. So they released this game on January 2017 for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. And so they had a lot of internal discussions on the direction of this installment. And, even though they had a early version of the game developed in 2013, it went from an idea that was going to be more action-oriented gameplay, similar to our Resident Evil 6, to what it actually became. And this one introduced a brand new character to the series, which was Ethan Winters, who explores the Baker family home, which was in a abandoned rural state in a mansion in Louisiana.
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 A place that we like to talk about. I'm sure Fred wants to talk about it. So have you guys both played 7?
I have played 7. As I mentioned earlier, spooky shit is not as much as what I'm into, which I think this leans like super heavily into the spooky shit,
Yeah.
which personally isn't as appealing to me, but I do think 7 is interesting because I think they really took the time to kind of reflect on the things that went wrong with 5 and 6. And maybe some of their influences to make it feel like appeal to more Western audiences rather than just like making a good game. And I think, going to first person is like really interesting in how immersive that it makes it feel. And then obviously ramping up on the horror elements rather than the action heavy gameplay of 5 and 6.
Yeah, which, again, I think Fred said it right at the beginning of the episode. It's different games are going to be for different types of people, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I imagine this felt a little more on your level.
Oh yeah, these next two entries they're up there for me. I get they're a little different, but it does bring back some of the stuff that I did miss, which was like the weapon rationing, or I guess ammo rationing. I feel 4 had some good stealth in it, and this has some great just stealth and try not to get caught, and some really interesting puzzles. They don't feel like traditional video game puzzles; they feel like story puzzles. And there's a really great one that like is in this like room with locks, and there's like a birthday cake, and you're like you have to carry a light to one area, but there's water that can put it out. Like it's very like Rube Goldberg-y like horror like stuff. Yeah. And I just really appreciate it. It's a gorgeous looking game. They just did like an upgrade for the PS5, I think, and it looks amazing.
Nice. Yeah, I definitely want to play it.
There's also like a VR version.
Yeah, I would love to do that. Oh, yes.
Gosh.
That's
I want to play Village in VR for sure.
Which is definitely a rumored game. I think that is going to come out if it hasn't been confirmed already. But yeah, I mean, this kind of felt to me, even I have not played 7 yet, so I'm definitely leaning on you guys, but it felt to me like the way they did Cloverfield, where it was like the first game was very much monster movie, found footage, and the second one was like a game that if you didn't know this was called Resident Evil 7, would you even have any suspicion it was part of the series?
Not really, no.
Yeah.
You'd have a better
idea. And I think it's interesting because, like, in the game, obviously the story isn't as directly connected, but, like, I think there's, like, you'll find like newspaper clippings that mention like the Spencer estate incident. So you kind of know that it's set in the world, but I think it's kind of part of, they kind of wanted to do somewhat of like a soft reset on the franchise just because like after how poorly received 6 is, they don't want to necessarily lean in to like their classic characters and tropes as much, which I think was great for the franchise. And I mean, this game is like super well received.
Are there a lot of zombies in it?
I remember there's very little action in it. Village ends up having more action in it.
Yeah.
But I kind of remember it being mostly exploring, it's kind of like in the first games where you're reading things you pick up and you're putting the story together that way, which I missed. Yeah, and it's a lot more stealth and puzzle stuff.
Interesting.
But there is like a moment where it goes ham where you can shoot a bunch and stuff. But
Got it. Which I think is something that I'd be interested to explore, or if it's not going to be like Resident Evil 4, I kind of wanted to go into more of that horror element, like a Layers of Fear type thing of like you're going around and just trying to avoid creeping yourself out. So yeah, and then obviously they did a direct sequel to this game for the first time in a few games, even though they're all connected loosely. And we talked about Wesker's story ending in 5, with Umbrella kind of ending in 3. But we get the direct sequel with Resident Evil Village, aka Resident Evil 8. Very cleverly put, the VII.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, which wonderful. So again, we have a first-person perspective in this, and it was released in May of 2021 for PlayStation 5 and Xbox One again. And they developed it pretty quickly. I mean, as we've known with a lot of these games, they develop them very quickly. And I would say a 4-year cycle for a sequel feels about on par, maybe even, quicker than some others get made nowadays. So it was in development for about 3.5 years, and then the director Morimasa Sato pitched a village setting as a way of building up from the previous game, kind of in a similar way to what they did with 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. Whereas like here inside, just like the mansion, right, to start, and now you're kind of getting into more of an open area. So it's almost a soft reboot in a way without necessarily being a reboot.
Mm-hmm. And Village is very Resident Evil 4.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think you kind of get, because that is where you start in 4, right? Is in that village in Spain.
Yeah, which is kind of like, I don't know if it's my favorite part of 4, but that's kind of like my favorite location is to like walk around the villages. That's why I think I really liked Village. It's a lot of that.
Yeah. And so in this one, it's Ethan Winters is back again, and he's looking for his kidnapped daughter in this village. And there's obviously these creatures out here that kind of lead him to Castle Dimitrescu. Is that how you say it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the big lady.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
Lady
big-
Dimitrescu.
Wasn't
Yeah.
that a time?
Yeah.
Whenever everyone's just so thirsty for that big lady.
Yeah.
I want some of that big lady action. I'm like, whoa.
You just stand in the middle of the house and just let her come get you. She's like the nemesis in those games.
Yeah. So isn't the whole thing though with the zombies in this one that they're more vampiric in a way?
Definitely. There's like vampire and werewolf elements, but because it's Resident Evil, we're not going to say the thing it is. It's going to be like their twist on these things.
So how are the zombies in Biohazard compared to Village?
I would say Biohazard, they're more traditional, and Village is, like you said, there's almost like they're leaning into like gothic horror elements where there's like gargoyles coming to life from statues and stuff like that. And there's there's the big lady who's kind of following you in the mansion. You got to be on your toes, but also in the village, there's like a wolf beast that can follow you. And a lot of people apparently didn't like that. They're like, Resident Evil is zombies. And I'm like, I don't necessarily believe that, but
Yeah.
it's a big part of it. But I feel like they never say zombies really, I feel, as much in the games because they want the thing to do whatever they want it to do, which is cool.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, I think every entry kind of there's a different strain of the virus that has different effects. So I
Right.
think like calling it a zombie or whatnot like doesn't necessarily make Resident Evil. It's more like that tension, that classic like rationing your ammo and like being like careful with your healing items and stuff like that. And I think the interesting thing with Village too is like Chris pops up in like 7 DLC and he's like more involved in 8, so it's kind of an interesting kind of callback to the entire Resident Evil franchise and the lore, but kind of within the world that 7 and 8 has been doing and telling like Ethan's story.
Yeah. And so the idea is that the strain in these games is still a derivative of the T virus, or is it something completely different, kind of like La Plagas?
It's something different. Yeah, it's not related to like the T virus, or like Umbrella isn't involved in 7 and 8.
Yeah, okay. All right, interesting. So I think we definitely have seen a big development of the series over time. And I think, again, we talked about it, that is one of the biggest draws for it. And I think it's acceptable to make experimentations like this. I think I even thought about like Blade when I was reading about this, because it's like, how do you escalate or how do you level up from having just vampires in like the first one, right? It's like, well, what if you develop a strain of vampires that eat other vampires, right? It's like, I think you always have to ask the questions of how do you stop, trying to change the story and like the characters so that it's like, oh, we're up in the ante here. It's like, how do you change like the actual villains, right? And like make them something more. And they're playing with like, kind of a killer family like Leatherface and like his family in Texas Chainsaw. You have that type of thing, sort of like the couple in Code Veronica, right? Or this brother and sister, not couple. That's,
Whoa,
that's a little
I don't know what version Tom played.
But yeah, I guess any other thoughts on just the games as a whole?
No, I think I'm just really excited for what comes next. Like I think
Definitely.
7 and 8, I think Capcom has shown
Yeah,
willingness to kind of reinvent the franchise and what Resident Evil really means. So I'm just excited to see what happens with 9 and beyond.
Yeah. The rumor for 9 right now is that 2025 is where we can probably expect that.
It's not too far away.
It's not too far.
It's a tough couple of years,
And
but
I will say, as a whole, as someone who's kind of late to it, Resident Evil 8 will be, and I don't buy games like when they first come out. I will buy that. Like,
Yeah.
I will pre-order that.
Nice.
Like, I've got the season tickets for the Resident Evil games.
tickets for it. One thing that I mean, before we even get into speculating about what 9 could look like, I think it's worth mentioning that adaptations of Resident Evil have been attempted, and there are 6 movies based on this. In fact, it holds the record for the most adaptations for a video game series. I think Mortal Kombat's probably coming up on its heels a little bit, but I think it's a great segue to talk about this with coulda, woulda, shoulda, because I think the movies had promise. The first two very closely follow kind of the ideas of what 1 and 2 are without being perfect adaptations. And I mean, Mia Jovovich is like a perfect person to cast in a movie like that because she is sort of like a template for like what a strong female protagonist can be in a movie. But it just lost the plot so badly after 2. And I know there's people who defend 3 and 4, but man, I think 2 was so bad.
Yeah, 2 I haven't seen it in a long time, but I hear 2 is colossally bad.
And it really took what was a promising premise in 1 and the ways to interpret that, and just kind of was like, let's try and carbon copy all the stereotypical things about the second game into the second movie. But also, let's squeeze in a character that's not related to the story at all.
Yeah, and it's definitely an era of like, now we have things like, you know, The Last of Us adaptation.
Yeah.
And movies and shows that are more respectful to the source material,
Yeah.
but also clever in how they're adapting it. Whereas like the movies are, you know, the first one showed some promise, but they eventually kind of is like, they're about like the action set pieces. And not like scary or thriller or horror at all.
Yeah.
They feel like 6, like the game 6.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think is funny coming from Paul W.S. Anderson, who was the director of all these movies, that he also directed probably what was arguably the most faithful adaptation of a video game movie with Mortal Kombat before he did Resident Evil 1. And I was like, so what happened here? I mean, and obviously Mortal Kombat 1 took some liberties with the story, but at the same end, it just felt like it's like, okay, so you guys got off to the right start, and then it just seemed like you're like, let's just go do our own thing. And I think to transition to coulda, woulda, shoulda, I would say, man, I would have loved to see them try and actually adapt these games the same way that The Last of Us just did with the TV series.
Yeah, get the people that did the FMV for RE1, get them in there. Like, shit, that was perfect. That's what I wanted.
I would watch a movie. It doesn't even have to be a Resident Evil movie. Just a movie with that schlockiness, intenseness. I'd love it. But I'd say the problem with a Resident Evil movie, TV show, whatever, is there's just been too many bites of the apple at this point, and it's like I don't think you'll get one. And they've all taken things from the games differently. That if you came with something that was a little more strict to the game, because apparently that Welcome to Raccoon City is like pretty much like the plot of 2 or something. I haven't seen it, but I hear it's bad, and I hear the TV show is bad.
Well, I think it kind of falls in the same trap that we just talked about with 6, of like, if you're going to make a cinematic version of Resident Evil, like, oh, well, all these characters shoot guns. Well, we got to make sure we got action sequences to make these exciting, when it's like, I think what people want is like what The Last of Us just did. Like, stalk around. You've got infected around every turn, and it's like, it's less about watching Pedro Pascal, shoot these zombies or whatever, right? And they don't use the Z word in that show, but it's more about the people involved. And I think there is, as fucking crazy as the lore is of Resident Evil, like there is something to that where if you try to lean into like these relationships, like there's a brother and sister working on this team together, right? There's partnerships that diminish over time, and like, or get stronger with people that they didn't expect to ally with.
Or just a police station that used to be a museum. Like, how can you not make like a cool movie set there?
Yeah, I always wondered if it was like, it would be cool if it was more of like a Japanese director take on it. Because like Japanese horror, like there's a lot of like horror films that, have been adapted that were like originally Japanese. So it'd be kind of interesting to see that kind of take on it that could lean into some of those aspects.
And I think we've seen a lot of good horror adaptations, or even like things that are replicated from that. You look at like The Grudge kind of gave birth to that whole like kind of like creepy little girl thing, right? Of like, or like ghosts, and how like there's like a different interpretation of like what it means to people, and it talks about like their personality rather than the scare factors. And it kind of informs something like the Babadook that really was a psychological exploration and is much less about the horror. And I think it's something that you would love to see somebody explore with Resident Evil. But as far as the game is concerned and where you guys want to see the series go, I think I know where Fred wants to go with 9. More like 7 and 8, or would you want to see a return to 4 now?
I was gonna pitch something. I want it to be a little different from everything else, just like a reinvention. But I feel it'd be a sticky one, which would be, I want an open world, but I want it to be smaller. And I like the idea of like having to clear out like houses or mansions, so you get to have Resident Evil 1 and 2 vibes inside a bigger game. Like, what if it's like Resident Evil Outback?
It's almost like
we'll come back with a better name, but just it's all in Australia, and you can like you have these tight, you're clearing out buildings, but also you can have a big grand scale.
It's almost like Witcher 3 or like one of those types of open world games where it's like, oh, this is like the side quest where I got to go in the mansion.
Yeah.
And then you have like your smaller game, more and then you can do bigger stuff too.
That's
Or-
interesting.
Not to lean too far into this game again, but like Last of Us 2, where like especially in that beginning part of the game, there is like aspects of like open world where you can go clear out a store so that you can like find like certain items for like a side quest. Yeah, I think that'd be very interesting. What about you, Joe? What would you want in 9?
So I think it's an interesting spot for the franchise because they kind of have like these two tracks that are running. One is, 7 and 8 and that storyline, and then the remakes, which are kind of going back and kind of it's pretty close to a retelling of like the original ones, but kind of enhancing it. But also there's like all of these animated movies that they've also been making that'll star like Leon and Chris and Jill and everybody. So it's kind of interesting that they have like they're appealing to those classic like Umbrella characters like Chris and Jill, but also introducing like all the new characters in 7 and 8. So I'm kind of interested. Well, first, they definitely need to do a remake of Code Veronica because I think that would kind of like not a lot of people have experienced that story.
Sure.
And I think kind of giving it the remake treatment that Capcom's been doing would, expose that to a completely new audience. But in 9, I would be interested in them kind of tying back to some of the classic RE characters and maybe like kind of giving them the send off that I think they kind of wanted 6 to be, but kind of lean heavily into like the horror aspects that they've learned from 7 and 8 and kind of pick up where that's going, but also kind of tie it back to some of the characters that we know and love and kind of give them the send off that they need.
That would be cool. Yeah.
Because Village was a big hit though, right? Like really well reviewed, and 7 was really well reviewed. So
Yeah, it was.
I don't know if I'll be able to. I don't know if I see them doing something too drastically different. To be honest, though, they might surprise us, but I feel they're like, this is working. They might try to add stuff to it, but I don't know.
Yeah, it does feel like they have some decisions to make here too, though, of like what track do they want to follow, or do they want to start like kind of splitting, not the timeline, necessarily, but it's like sort of like, okay, if you want your more like RE4 remake vibes, we're gonna give you this type of game, or if you want more of the first person kind of like horror element, we're going to give you this type of game. And maybe it's like, Resident Evil 9, and then you have Resident Evil like Omega or something. I don't know. They've made a lot of other games that we didn't have time to cover on this, but it's definitely things that you want to see them keep exploring, right?
Yeah, they did like a Mercs like online fight thing that I remember playing a little and it just wasn't working for me. But I think that could have been good.
Yeah, they did also do Outbreak, which was like an online game where you could kind of like pick your class and you're basically kind of like escaping from Raccoon City as it's about to blow up and like during the events of 2 and 3, which was kind of ahead of its time because like online gaming during like the PS2 era wasn't really a thing. And yeah, I think that could be pretty interesting, kind of getting an RE spin on it of like co-op horror, which I don't think anyone's really done successfully yet, or maybe I would like to see a better take on it than like 5 and 6 just because those were so action heavy, but I think there's something that could be really fun there.
Resident Evil Outback's gonna have all that.
Resident Evil Outback, I love it.
Kangaroo busting through a window.
Oh shit.
It's just like, should we get to our power rankings, guys?
Yes.
Ooh,
yes.
let's go.
Yes.
Yeah. So I have not played 3 of the games in the series. So I'll just throw out right away that like if I had to pick obviously 4 I think is my favorite that I played because it was the only one I played from start to finish. But I thought 1 was fun. I would love to go back and play that again. I think 2 remake really seems like probably next on my list. I might just jump into that without even finishing 1, just because now I feel like I don't necessarily need to finish 1 to play it. But Joe, where would you go with your top 3? Haven't played a lot of them.
So are we combining like the remake and the original
I
version
would say
as one?
separate the remakes.
Ooh, man. Because like if we separate the remakes, I'd say like OG4 number 1, remake 4 number 2. I think that's just how good it is. I think like the story is so good. I think the OG version especially, like it just was so innovative in its like control schemes, and I think has inspired a lot of other games. And then I think number 3 would be 2 remake. I think like they just really like redefined what it meant to be a remake. Like it's just like a complete reinvention of how 2 works, but while also staying truthful to like the story of 2 and like the themes of 2 and like the horror elements of 2. And like, yeah, I just want them to keep remaking these games just because they do it so well.
Sure. Okay, so if you had to add another numbered entry into that after those 3.
I would probably put Code Veronica number 3, just because I think it's like kind of like that gothic spookiness that Fred was mentioning. I think, having Claire as a playable character, like it was cool to see her come back and get her own game.
Yeah.
And also bringing back like Chris and Wesker. And I think, like I said in Coulda, Woulda, Shoulda, I think it's something that people have really been wanting to see remade just because it kind of came out on Dreamcast and PS2. And I think, a lot of people haven't played through it.
Yeah. No, I think that'd be cool. It'd be nice to see a remake of Code Veronica and 0, to be honest.
Oh, yeah.
I think those
Yeah.
will probably be the next 2. We'll see what they do with 5. What about you, Fred?
So it's hard for me to do 4 just because I just finished it, but I'll try again there. I think number 1 for me, I'm gonna just say the 2 remake,
Nice.
and I think it's just because it has all the touches of all the games in 2. It's definitely more geared towards the older games, but I feel it gets actiony, it's spooky, and there's puzzles. It's got it all. And then I would probably put Village number 2. I really like Village a lot. I'm probably gonna play through again because I never played the DLC. And then for 3, like it's really between 4 and 7 for me. Like they are right now just neck and neck. I'm just leave it at that. I'm
That's
just
cool.
gonna say they're like tied for 3rd, 4 and 7.
Maybe we'll have to revisit the rankings too once everything's a little more settled in. But I mean, those are very good picks. I'm excited to play 7 and 8 too. I didn't mention them, but I think 7 might be. I mean, it's either going to be that or remake 2 that comes next. So I think that does get us to the end of the episode here, guys. Joe, obviously, we really appreciate you always coming in and being a guest on here. We're a first guest and still.
Oh, yeah. Happy to be back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything you would like to plug though at this time?
No, not really. I guess one thing for Resident Evil fans is there is a book called Itchy Tasty that's written by this guy, Alex Anil, who is a huge Resident Evil fan, but he lives in Japan now, and he actually interviewed a bunch of the creators of Resident Evil and kind of talks about, their processes and struggles and kind of how the Resident Evil series came to be. So I'd recommend checking that out for people that are fans of the franchise.
I like it. All right. Itchy Tasty?
Itchy Tasty. Yeah, it's inspired by like a line in Resident Evil 1 and like one of the notes that's left by one of the zombies, or a man that's turning into a zombie, like eventually just says Itchy Tasty, and it's kind of like I think in the Japanese version it was more of like an inspiration to like memes in that language in Japanese, but it's where the book title comes from.
Gotcha.
Itchy Tasty makes me think that like they got bit, so like they're gross, but now that they're turning into zombie, that nastiness sounds delicious.
Yeah. They got that craving for flesh.
It does. Yeah, seems like it. What about you, Fred? Anything you'd like to plug?
Just listen to the pod. Tom's gonna hit you with all the facts.
That's right. I shall. You can find us on X. I hate saying that. Facebook, Instagram, Threads. We are at State of the Franchise with Fred and Tom. You can find our handles on there. You can find our information on our link tree, State of the Franchise with Fred and Tom. We have our episodes all listed on there, all of our social links. You can email us at stateofthefranchisepodcast@gmail.com. You can also leave us a donation, a one-time donation on our link tree now is available. That goes directly to us, no third-party vendor. It's great. And we also have a lot more fun stuff coming up for you guys. Some announcements that will probably be coming near the end of the month, maybe into the following month. But obviously, we're always happy to just have you guys as listeners. So thank you for tuning in. And I know last time we gave a tease of Scream, and what we meant to say is that the next episode was going to be a Scream. It was Resident Evil, but the next episode we will be talking about the franchise of the movies, the Scream franchise. Just had to back it up a little bit, but we have a real treat in for you guys there, so we hope you tune in then. And thanks again for being here, Joe, and we'll see you guys next time.
Why?
Umbrella bad.
Umbrella bad.
And what they told you about will always